I often come across affirmatives like old games used to be better, and even though I don't completely agree, I think there's certainly some validity to them. A lot of the big AAA games nowadays seem to follow almost like a checklist of trends that might help them to meet their financial quotas, and the repetitiveness gets tiring. Old games have an atmosphere that is really difficult to capture. In this video, we'll ponder the question, were old games better? Games from the PS1 generation had an aesthetic of their own, a kind of dreamlike atmosphere. Games like Rayman 2. The year was 1995. At the time, an iconic mascot was what those companies were striving for. We've had the great success of Pac-Man, who managed to become a cultural icon, even starring in cartoons. Mario was a huge established character for a decade. Sonic was also big. I mean, the year after Rayman 1, we had Crash Bandicoot from Naughty Dog. The arms race for a company mascot was out, and Rayman was Ubisoft's response to that. Most of you know Rayman from the party games with the Raving Rabbits or the latest 2D platforming games, which are great. They shared the gameplay design of the original whilst feeling new and fresh. But Rayman 2 felt different. As more and more 3D games were coming out, it was time for Rayman to make the push for the third dimension, and it was incredible. The PS1 aesthetic was different because of the console's own limitations. The way it dealt with 3D objects caused the scenery and objects to move in a weird, uncanny manner. The sounds had to be compressed to be played in the console because of the limitations of the time, giving a different quality to them. The way Rayman 2 was built enhanced that. The music invoked this hauntingly mystical and magical feeling. The colors, the sound, and the level design complemented that ethereal, otherworldly dream atmosphere of the PS1 generation. The same can be said about Spider-Man Enter Electro. A lot of the games had this obscure quality to them. The music was haunting, the sounds were fewer and limited. But games like Toy Story 2 took it in another direction, even though some of those obscure PS1 qualities were still there. I think the idea of being small around normal day-to-day objects is really cool, and definitely perfect for a video game. As a kid, it felt magical to be able to interact with the world of the movies and the characters, and the idea of exploring every nook and cranny of the house to find any secrets I could felt amazing. Even if the progression of the levels were really simplistic, consisting on gathering Pizza Hut tokens from every level. There was this puzzle in which you had to mix primary colors to get the ones you needed, like getting green from blue and yellow. I still remember how smart I felt when I was able to get through the puzzle by singing a song my teacher used to teach me the mixture of colors. Amazing puzzle design, because that's definitely the kind of thing that a kid would be learning and would be glad to see being used. The art of the game aged really well. I think those games with simplistic art style and bright color spectrum end up not aging that much, especially when replicating toys that are, by themselves, simpler designs than humanoids. The simplicity of the time can be pleasing in a way, especially compared to some of the later generations that focus more on realism, which made some of those games with shades of brown aesthetic not age that well. As games evolve, the graphics becoming better, the quality of the sound improving, and more pixels being pushed on screen, some of those qualities are lost. A good example of this is the Demon's Souls remake. I love the remake, and I think it's one of the best looking games on PS5. Some of the original fans don't like it, and I can understand why. In the original Demon's Souls and in the first Dark Souls, you had that smoky atmospheric feel to it all, an emptiness that was amplified by the echoes of your footsteps, and even from the menu sounds, it felt like a hazy dream, almost like suddenly opening your eyes, confused and disoriented, thrust into an unclear nightmare. It helped to give the world an uncanny, mystical and oppressive feeling. As you try to modernize old classics, some of that atmosphere is inherently lost. Besides a few controversial changes to some of the character designs, like this guy, the huge leap in graphical fidelity results in a completely different atmosphere to the game. They probably could have been a little more faithful to the original game, but it would have looked less appealing. The fans' criticism gains even more strength given that there's no official modern way to play the original game. The original Demon Souls is still stuck on the PS3, so the option to play it is sadly limited to the old console or emulators on PC. The mentality of Bluepoint, the creators of the remake, is understandable. There's a disparity between what the creators of the original game had in mind and what it morphed into because of the limitations of the time and the ingenuity necessary to overcome them. Some of those design choices were driven by the limitations they had, and those are not here anymore, making it a difficult line to thread. When launching a new game, you want to appeal to as many people as you can, and I think some of those design choices are made to reflect that. I really like the remake, but I can empathize with the fans of the original game who weren't as satisfied with it, because when you love something, you want to see made justice. I had a great time revisiting Resident Evil 4 and Dead Space, and was finally able to play Demon Souls because of the remake. It got me thinking about other games we weren't so lucky as to get modern ways to play, like the amazing Resistance series on PS3 or Bloodborne that could really use a new port. There's a big discontent with remakes as of late, but I actually like and enjoy good remakes. They allow for a new public to engage with great games by giving them a more attractive shell, even if sometimes they lose some of their qualities. Unless you are actively trying to emulate an aesthetic, like the fantastic Bloodborne remake that emulates the PlayStation 1's, it's impossible not to lose some of those qualities when transitioning from one generation to another. I mean, take the 8-bit or 16-bit generation of games in comparison with the 3D generation. Games were more limited and the audio more compressed. It defined the whole gaming aesthetic as we know it nowadays with its super compressed audio and pixelated graphics. A lot of those qualities were lost in transition, but we got other things from that generation in return as well. The way we consume games has evolved since the times of the arcades. Their genres and tools at developers' disposal have expanded. We usually create from the things that we know, and that's how games started, based on scoring points in sports and eventually even direct adaptations of tabletop RPGs. Games changed, and little by little they have become something else entirely, each generation defined by their advances and their technological limitations. Limitations can drive creativity. Remedy is a great example of this. The company never had a huge budget for the development of their games. Cutscenes were always expensive, but over the years they developed numerous solutions to problems just like this one. In Max Payne 1, they told the story with live-action comic book panels to save on resources. The main character wasn't cast, he was portrayed by none other than Sam Lake, who wrote and designed levels for the game. He became part of their DNA over the years. Live-action scenes were used in Quantum Break, and was too disruptive in that game, consisting of live-action episodes in between gameplay. They have been evolving, used seamlessly in Control and reaching new heights in Alan Wake 2, with an implementation that is both visually stunning and revolutionary. It fits the whole theme and atmosphere of the game, and it helps to create this odd disparity that gives the game a dreamlike quality that is pertinent to the narrative. When we play with Alan in the Dark Place, a city of dreams of sorts that exists beneath the lake, objects and structures have this wavy effect to them, like if produced by a faint remembrance of their real counterparts projected into water, looking realistic until you look close enough, which reinforces that idea that it's a dream reality that exists beneath the lake, morphed into a resemblance of Alan's memories. It's funny because structures moving the way they do kinda emulate that PlayStation 1 dream aesthetic in a more subtle way. That characteristic that was so central to the experience of playing a PlayStation 1 title is a small part of this one. A good measurement to the amount of tools at developers' disposal and how big and complex games have gotten over the years. Remedy games have always had a certain charm to them. In Max Payne, you had those inner dialogues of the main character, an introspective detective with a dark perspective on life, constantly acknowledging the situation with acidic humor and sarcastic remarks. It's something they do in their games to this day. In Alan Wake, Alan, who is a writer, talks directly to the player, as if talking to the readers of his book. In Control, Jessie Faden talks to an entity in her head that guides her to the objectives, effectively talking to us. The meta aspects of their games are complemented by the games having in-lore reasons to talk to the player and the use of live action to tell the story, which, alongside their amazing artistic vision, creates a whole unique aura surrounding their games. Even if not as iconic as Silent Hill, the small town of Bright Falls is moody and eerie, creating a sense of cautious excitation, curiosity, and wonder. The oldest house in Control looks mundane with its office design, contrasting beautifully with the fantastical nature of the building that moves and changes constantly. Max Payne's underbelly of New York feels somehow weirdly realistic to this day, with a grimy ambience that we see criminally little in video games, adapted modernly in Alan Wake 2's New York that resembles that dirty city and neon aesthetic we see in the likes of John Wick. It's something we see in a lot of movies actually. The magical world of Harry Potter is often portrayed in the movies as dirty and dusty, as a means not to alienate the viewer in the fantasy of the world and drive them to care about the story and the characters, immersed in the belief that there are stakes. In Max Payne, it helps to add to the dark lenses of the game, adding to the heavy story beats. And in Alan Wake 2, it helps to ground the more fantastical elements of the dark place in reality. The charm Remedy has managed to maintain to this day is something derived from their oldest games, just like the difficulty in From Software's games. Older games used to be hard, not only because the movement could be clunky, but they were challenging and generally wouldn't hold the player's hands as much. Quality is still present in From Software games' DNA to this day, and it sets them apart. If I were to describe the Souls games shortly, I wouldn't describe them as difficult per se, but brutally fair. When you lose a fight, it's often clear what you did wrong and what you can do better next time. A higher difficulty that feels fair, like the Souls games, is a result of good game design. Game design is the process of creating and shaping mechanics, rules, and systems of a game. One of its pillars is player experience. In older games, game design was a young concept, taking years to take shape. Adapting to the player's mind has proven to be just as complex undertaking as making games. That's why some older games are difficult, but not as fair. If the player feels like the game was unfairly difficult, he might feel frustrated and stop engaging with it. So, games adapted as time went by. In the old days of the arcades, the main draw of games used to be the challenge, to go for as long as you could in games like Pac-Man and Space Invaders, playing with your friends in Pong. Funny thing about Pong is, it was one of the first games to gain popularity, and it's the first game a lot of developers learned how to make. Whether playing against each other or trying to beat someone else's high score, the inherent nature of games were competitive, which is a reason as to why older games used to be harder in general, a inheritance of those pioneer games. Losing meant you'd have to use another coin to keep it going, so difficulty was incentivized. Eventually players got so good that they would go on for hours, detracting over time from the revenue of the arcades and dulling the public's interest in the game. A lesson for game design: if the player doesn't feel challenged, they may lose interest. Someone was going to take advantage of this. That's how Mrs. Pac-Man came to be, made by General Computer as a mod kit for the original Pac-Man, with the goal of making the game more difficult, unpredictable, rentable, and interesting to the players. And it was a huge hit. It worked because it didn't change the difficulty by just increasing numbers, like adding a few more goals to get to you. It fundamentally changed the game and how players would engage with it. The games that came in the following decades weren't hard just because these games were, but the origins of games were based on the difficulty aspect of them. The challenge, the competition. Those traits are still present in modern gaming. We still get games with leaderboards. Competitive games are really popular and there are a lot of hard games. Sometimes difficulty is not the main drive and it's actually just trying to tell a story. But even if the struggle of a game wasn't always the main drive, how to deal with difficulty became more and more important over the years. Story games couldn't be too hard to manage to maintain pacing and immersion, but not too easy as not to alienate the player. Games crafted to be streamed could be hard and unfair because they make for an entertaining experience for the viewer, but competitive games have to be balanced, otherwise the player feels cheated. Game design had to evolve to embrace different genres of games and the different ways people are engaging with them. With a world now more interconnected than ever, the opinions of each individual matter way more than it did before, and consequently the perception of games. Contrary to older games that focused on difficulty and replayability, if you don't finish a modern game that focuses on story, you'll hardly buy its sequel. That's one of the pillars modern game design centers around of, providing a fulfilling experience to the player as opposed to a frustrating one. That's where a lot of games miss the mark: player experience. Whereas before there was a lot less guidance, now there's an overcorrection. In the efforts of guiding the player, they hold their hands so tight that it takes away all fulfillment of figuring out on their own. It's when the character gives you the answer to the puzzle before you could even think about it. When the game highlights every piece of content on the map, taken away from exploration. It's the theme of one of my last videos in which I talked about how one of the best feelings in video games is the wonder of discoverability. In that video, I used Assassin's Creed Valhalla as a negative example of taking the mystery out of games, and it looked like I hated that game when, in fact, I really liked it and told my friends to play it at the time. It just so happens that Ubisoft is a big example of those things that plague the gaming industry. Content is sometimes spoon-fed so that the player doesn't miss anything, which can take away the fulfillment of said activity. The map is filled with map markers and filler activities to make sure you can find, engage, and spend as much time as possible with their games, feeling overwhelming and boring. The monetization of the game breaks immersion. Few things change from sequel to sequel and they end up making their main entries all feel the same. Trying to appeal to the widest possible audience and extract as much money as possible, their games lose some of what made them special. It's frustrating because the story is good and there are some legitimately good side quests in the game, but those other things keep the games from being great. In this environment, games like Elden Ring feel fresh because we can see absolutely zero hand-holding. The player is guided, but he doesn't realize it, and that's damn good game design. The game draws your attention subconsciously with buildings standing out amidst the scenery, begging to be explored, and the map organically guides and directs the player to explore and discover its secrets. In the early days of video games, guiding the player wasn't a big worry as it is today. It still was important, of course, but now games have gotten bigger and attention spans have gotten smaller. A big worry for developers is getting the players to finish their games. Game design had to evolve to engage the player, but guiding the player too obviously had the opposite effect of the dust and dirt in the Harry Potter movies. It broke immersion and diminished engagement. It alienates the player. That's where games like The Last of Us and Uncharted shine, cinematic experiences inspired by movie direction. They are cinematic because, like a good movie director, they take great care and effort in the direction of their scenes and story. That care is directly reflected in their game design. Instead of a marker leading you, they'll usually slightly pull the camera toward the right path. Maybe they'll cast a light so you take one path over the other, subconsciously guiding us to the better experience. Not to say that they don't use markers or don't give away the answer to puzzles, because some of them do, but the design of their levels is what guides the player and immersion is their top priority. Cinematic video games were a huge leap for immersion and positively influenced game design by using subtle cues derived from movies to guide the player. So, were old games better? Over the course of this video, I showed you multiple eras of games, and for every generational jump, we could see what was lost and what was gained from them. The question is hard, and if I am to answer it plainly, I would say no, older games are not better. The question was born from a discontent with the current generation of games, seen through a very narrow viewpoint. One that disconsiders a lot of amazing games we got and tries to rationalize something that isn't an exact science. Games have gotten bigger and better over the years. We get soulless corporate games, but that's not all we get. Even with the mishaps and bad practices, we still get amazing, passionate games. From AAA developers that still put out amazing products to creative independent studios that manage to steal the spotlight. The best games I have played are from the last decade, and I keep getting surprised by amazing games every year. Game design has evolved substantially, even if a few games miss the mark completely. But even if I can point out the things that have gotten better, the answer to this question is subjective. It always has been. How could I ever give a definitive answer? Old games can be like books, outlines of a reality, vague enough so that we have to fill in the blanks, catalysis for our imagination, beautiful symbiosis between what the developers created and what our minds turned them into. Newer games have gotten better at storytelling, game design, and graphics. The creator's intent is expressed way more clearly. Aspects of other media are intrinsically woven into the experience, and still, some of them retain some of those qualities from old games, especially indie titles. They offer such a hugely different experience that they might as well be two different mediums. The limitations of the times help to build beautiful artistic contrasts from generation to generation, like a mold that kept getting bigger and bigger, allowing more creativity and versatility. I enjoy modern games more because, to me, they are more pleasing and engaging, but I keep coming back to older games because they offer something unique. A lot of people would rather play older games, and I try to show you why they might. There is beauty in every generation. Differences in art, atmosphere, and game design. The lack of hand-holding can feel so good when it clicks. I wanted to demonstrate how some games that came out to this day retain some of those qualities, like how Elden Ring doesn't directly guide the player, how Remedy managed to replicate some of that dream atmosphere of the PS1, and over the years kept to and improved their own aesthetics, creating something unique. How, even with a lot to be discontent in the gaming industry nowadays, there are so many great games to play, old and new. The screen might not look as realistic as the Mona Lisa, but that was never its intent. The way the figures are distorted highlight the feeling of panic and desperation. The brush strokes simulate a fluid motion, almost like the image moves in an unnerving manner, like if desperation itself distorts every part of it. Kinda how objects moved on the PlayStation 1. Were old games better? The question is subjective because art is subjective, and nostalgia plays a part. Even if disconsidered at times, its importance shrugged as if a feeling that should be disconsidered, forgotten, and shamed. Lenses that supposedly distort the exact truth of the matter. But nostalgia is nothing but the reflection of how something impacted us before. Maybe even a resonance of a particular moment we associated with. It shouldn't be disconsidered because nostalgia is nothing but raw emotion. I can't say a style of painting is better than the other when sometimes art can be about how it makes you feel. Maybe telling you which one is better is not the point of this video, but to point out how games have evolved and changed, how they owe everything to what came before, and how old games have something special. You may like older titles because of how they make you feel, how the atmosphere speaks to you, or how the gameplay entices you to play. It may even be nostalgia. If we're being honest, nostalgia might even be a better measurement of quality. Even if heightened and distorted by our perception of it over time, nostalgia encapsulates an exacerbated feeling we had for the game at the moment we played it. Removed from the biases of experiences we had since then and fully immersed in real circumstances of the time, from our age and maturity to the games that had been released until that moment. Maybe I was just looking for a reason to talk about the games I have loved and care about. Games that were important to me, helped to shape me into who I am. Games that left a mark one way or another, even if the constant evolutionary aspects of games insist on leaving them behind, forgotten by time. Games that remind me of good moments in my life. When I used to sneak into my older brother's room to play Super Mario World with him on his SNES when I was a kid, or how I always play Luigi when given a choice, because when I used to play with my younger sister, she'd only wanted to play as Mario. The time I spent my vacation at my great-grandma's house and she would say I was hard at work and made me lunch, even though she knew I was just playing Skyrim. That game will always remind me of how sweet she used to be. Like these games helped shape me, the games that came before helped to build the foundation of the games we see today, each with their own contribution, pushing the limits ever so slightly towards something new and incredible. If there's any takeaway from my reflections on the matter, is that we should be thankful for the beautiful experiences we get today and to the incredible masterpieces that made them possible. To all the games that helped to shape me and the people who made them possible, thank you. And thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it and would like to see more, subscribe. Until the next one, bye.